In a dusty Arizona frontier town, ranch hand Caleb Turner is hauled before the sheriff after a brawl. To avoid jail, the law forces him into an arranged marriage with Nayeli, a proud Apache widow whose husband was killed by settlers. Asterisk, the sun was a burning brand above the Arizona sky, beating down on the little mining town of Cedar Ridge. Dust rolled like smoke down the main street, stirred by horses and wagon wheels, settling in the cracks of boots and the creases of sweat-stained hats. It was the kind of day when tempers flared quicker than kindling, and trouble didn't need much coaxing to find a man. That's exactly how Caleb Turner wound up in the sheriff's office with a split lip and blood on his knuckles. He sat slumped in a wooden chair, hat tossed on the floor, jaw clenched against the sting of shame. Caleb was no stranger to a brawl. He'd been swinging fists since he was knee-high and learning to break colts. But this time the fight had stirred up more dust than he'd bargained for. "You gone too far, Turner." The voice was dry as mesquite bark. Sheriff Elias Boone stood behind his desk, a tall man with steel-gray hair and a mustache sharp as a branding iron. His badge gleamed in the shafts of sunlight cutting through the window blinds. Caleb spat a line of blood into a tin cup. "He called me a half-breed lover. Said my mama raised me worse than a coyote. You expect me to sit and smile at that?" Boone's eyes narrowed. "I expect you to think past your fists. This town's tired of your temper. And this time, the council's done listening to excuses." Caleb's fists balled in his lap. He'd worked the ranches around Cedar Ridge for years, drifting from one job to another. Never had much except his horse, his saddle, and his pride. But in a place like Cedar Ridge, pride didn't stretch far when folks already thought you were a man without roots. "What's the council got to do with me cracking a drunkard's jaw?" Caleb asked, voice low. The sheriff leaned forward, palms flat on the desk. "Everything. Folks here don't just want peace, they want to send a message. And right now, that message lands square on your shoulders." Caleb's stomach tightened. He didn't like the way Boone's words felt like a trap closing. The sheriff motioned toward the door, and for the first time, Caleb noticed someone standing in the shadows. A woman. She stepped into the light, and Caleb's breath caught before he could stop it. She was tall, with long dark hair braided down her back and eyes as black as obsidian. Her features were proud, cut sharp as mountain stone, and she carried herself like someone who'd weathered storms most men couldn't imagine. She wore a faded calico dress, the hem dusty from the desert, and a turquoise pendant hung at her throat. "This here's Nayeli," the sheriff said, his tone formal. "Widow of Dakota. Some of you knew him, Apache scout, fought for the Union during the war. He was killed last winter." Caleb straightened in his chair. He remembered whispers about the scout who'd been shot dead while hunting near the river, though no one ever proved who pulled the trigger. And now his widow stood here, gaze steady, lips pressed in a thin line. "What's she got to do with me?" Caleb asked slowly. Boone's eyes hardened. "She's been catching hell since her husband died. Town don't take kindly to her living alone on the edge of Cedar Ridge. Some say it ain't decent. Some want her land. Either way, council figures she needs protection, and you, Turner, are just the man to provide it." Caleb blinked, the meaning sinking in like a stone in deep water. "You can't be serious." "I'm dead serious," Boone replied. "You want to keep your hide out of jail, you marry her. Today." The words landed like a pistol shot. Caleb shot to his feet. "That ain't law, it's madness. You can't force a man into marriage." The sheriff's gaze was steady, cold. "It's this, or I lock you up. 30 days hard labor in Yuma. You think you'll come out of that alive?" Caleb's throat went dry. He knew Yuma prison sun-baked stone, iron chains, men who came out hollowed. His hands itched at the thought. He turned to the woman, to Nayeli. Her expression was unreadable, carved from the same desert rock as the mesas outside town. She neither asked for his help nor offered him mercy. Why me? Caleb rasped out for the first time. Nayeli spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm, threaded with an accent that marked her Apache blood. Because the council thinks you are as unwanted as I am. Maybe they believe pairing two outcasts will make one problem easier to carry. Her words cut sharper than any blade. Caleb looked back at the sheriff, fury and disbelief warring in his chest. But beneath it all, a strange unease stirred the sense that his life was about to be yoked to a destiny he hadn't chosen. The sheriff slid a paper across the desk. Sign, Turner, or start praying for shade in Yuma. Caleb stared at the marriage license, then at Nayeli's dark eyes. Somewhere deep down, in a place he didn't dare name, a storm began to gather. The church bell of Cedar Ridge tolled high and hollow, each strike echoing off the clapboard storefronts and dusty hitching posts. Folks spilled into the street like ants stirred from a nest, curious to see the spectacle Sheriff Boone had cooked up. News traveled fast in a small town, and by mid-afternoon everyone knew. Caleb Turner, the brawler, was being forced to marry the Apache widow. Caleb adjusted his collar, sweat slicking the back of his neck. He hadn't worn his Sunday shirt since Easter last year, and it fit about as comfortably as a branding iron against bare skin. The preacher stood waiting at the front of the church steps, Bible clutched in his hands, looking like a man about to officiate a hanging rather than a wedding. Across from him stood Nayeli. She hadn't changed into anything fancy, just the same calico dress, freshly washed, with her hair rebraided so tight it gleamed in the sunlight. She didn't glance at Caleb, didn't even twitch. Her stillness was unnerving, like the quiet before a desert storm. Behind them, townsfolk murmured. Caleb caught snatches of words. Shameful. Lawless, good riddance if they leave town together. A few women covered their children's eyes as though watching such a marriage might bring bad luck. Caleb swallowed hard. He wasn't a man who rattled easy, but standing here, side by side with a stranger, he felt his insides twist. This wasn't how life was supposed to play out. He was supposed to be riding herd, drinking at the saloon on payday, maybe drifting north to Montana come spring. Not shackled to a woman he didn't know, in a union born of punishment. Sheriff Boone cleared his throat. Let's get on with it, preacher. Folks got chores waiting. The preacher's voice trembled as he opened his Bible. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today. Caleb tuned out the rest. His mind drifted to Nayeli. He couldn't stop glancing at her profile, the proud set of her chin, the way her hands rested loosely at her sides. No ring, no flowers, no family to stand with her. Just silence. When the preacher asked for vows, Caleb's jaw locked. He muttered the words, each one tasting like sand in his mouth. I do. Nayeli's turn came. She lifted her chin, eyes scanning the crowd. For a heartbeat, Caleb thought she might refuse, that she'd turn and walk back into the desert, leaving him to rot in Yuma prison. But her lips parted, and her voice rang clear. I do. A ripple of shock coursed through the crowd. The preacher slammed the Bible shut, his forehead beaded with sweat. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. May God have mercy. The kiss. Tradition demanded it. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, but before he could move, Nayeli stepped back, spine stiff, gaze straight ahead. There would be no kiss. Not here, not now. A low murmur of disapproval swept through the crowd. Some spat in the dirt. Others shook their heads. But Caleb felt a strange surge of relief. He wasn't ready to taste the lips of a woman who clearly despised the whole charade as much as he did. Boone clapped his hands once. That's it. Show's over. Turner, you and your new wife best head to her place. She's got a homestead needs keeping. Caleb retrieved his hat from the rail, pulling it low over his brow. Naeli didn't wait for him. She strode off toward the edge of town where her horse was tied. He followed, aware of every eye boring into his back. On the walk, he tried to break the silence. "Listen, I didn't ask for this any more than you did. Soon as I figure a way to get out, I'll—" She stopped cold, turning to face him. Her eyes were like twin coals, smoldering. "Do not speak of leaving. You may think this is punishment. For me, it is survival. Do you understand?" Caleb opened his mouth, then shut it again. Her words carried weight heavier than iron chains. They mounted their horses without another word, riding side by side out of Cedar Ridge. The town behind them buzzed with whispers, but ahead stretched the wide, wild desert, the land where their uneasy union would be tested. As the sun dipped low, painting the mesas in fire, Caleb cast one more glance at his bride. She was a stranger, yet tied to him now by law and circumstance. And though he didn't know it yet, that bond, fragile, unwilling, but unbreakable, was about to set both their lives ablaze. The ride to Naeli's homestead was long and silent, the kind of silence that didn't come easy. Caleb was used to jawing with cowhands, laughing in saloons, or at least humming a trail song when the desert stretched endless. But with Naeli riding beside him, every word he thought of stuck in his throat. Her horse moved like a shadow, smooth and sure-footed. She didn't bother with reins half the time, just a gentle squeeze of her knees, a soft murmur in Apache, and the animal obeyed. Caleb couldn't help but notice how she rode straighter than most men he knew, back proud, eyes scanning the land like she belonged to it and it to her. By the time the homestead came into view, the sun was sliding down behind the mesas, smearing the sky with rust and gold. Her place wasn't much. A low adobe house, smoke curling from the chimney, a few corral posts leaning like old drunks, and rows of beans and squash struggling in the sandy soil. But it was neat, cared for, sturdy against the wind. Naeli dismounted first, landing light as a feather. Caleb swung down slower, his legs stiff from the long ride. She didn't wait for him, just led her horse into the corral and slipped the bridle loose. Caleb followed, unsure if he was a husband, a ranch hand, or an intruder. Inside, the house smelled of sage and wood smoke. A single room with a hearth, a narrow bed against one wall, and shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and cornmeal. Everything had a place, everything tidy. Caleb felt clumsy just standing there, hat in hand. "You will sleep there." Naeli pointed to a blanket rolled out in a corner near the door. Her voice was calm, firm, not unkind, but not inviting either. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "Figures. Guess I should be grateful you didn't tell me to sleep in the barn." She didn't smile. Instead, she knelt by the hearth, coaxing a flame to life. Soon the smell of beans and venison stew filled the air, and Caleb's stomach growled loud enough to make him shift in embarrassment. She ladled 2 bowls, setting one on the table. For a moment, Caleb thought she might sit opposite him. Instead, she carried her bowl outside, settling on the porch where the desert wind blew cool. He ate alone, the stew hot and seasoned with herbs he didn't recognize. After supper, Caleb stepped out onto the porch. Naeli sat with her knees drawn up, staring at the horizon. The moon had climbed, painting the land in silver light. Coyotes yipped in the distance. "You always eat outside?" Caleb asked. "It is quieter," she replied without turning. He leaned against the post, chewing over his words. "Listen, I know you didn't ask for this marriage. Truth is, neither did I, but the sheriff gave me no choice. I don't aim to make your life harder than it already is." Her gaze slid to him at last, sharp as a hawk's. "You think your words changed the council's judgment? Or the whispers in town? They see me as Apache first, widow second, woman last. You are only here to make them feel they have solved a problem." Caleb exhaled, feeling the weight of her truth. "Maybe, but I ain't the kind of man who shirks work. If I'm here, I'll pull my weight, for the first time." Her expression softened just a flicker, like dawn breaking for a heartbeat before clouds covered the sun. She nodded once, then looked back to the horizon. That night, Caleb lay on the blanket by the door, staring at the ceiling. The adobe walls held the day's heat, and outside, the desert whispered. Sleep came slow. He kept thinking about her, about the fire in her eyes, the strength in her silence, the loneliness wrapped around her like a second skin dot by morning. He learned she rose before first light. He stumbled outside to find her kneeling in the garden, hands buried in the earth, whispering a song he didn't understand. When she noticed him, she didn't stop, just kept singing, her voice low and steady, as if the plants themselves needed to hear. Caleb felt out of place, like a bull in a chapel. But he also felt something else, a tug deep inside, a curiosity he hadn't expected. She wasn't just surviving. She was rooted, strong, alive in ways he'd never known. And though they barely spoke, though the gulf between them was wide as the canyon, Caleb realized this. Life on the edge of town was going to test him more than any brawl or roundup ever had. Cedar Ridge wasn't the kind of town to let anything slip by unnoticed. By the time a week had passed, everyone knew Caleb Turner was living out at the Apache widow's place. The whispers followed him every time he rode in for supplies at the general store, in the saloon, even at the blacksmith's forge. "Look at him," one rancher muttered loud enough for Caleb to hear. "Took up with her just to get a patch of land. Wouldn't surprise me if he's digging for silver already." Caleb ignored it as best he could, jaw tight, hands steady. But he felt the heat of their stares burning his back like the desert sun. He knew the truth. Men didn't hate him for the marriage itself. They hated what Nayeli represented. To them, she wasn't a woman holding on to her husband's land. She was an Apache standing her ground where they thought no Apache belonged. When he returned home one evening, arms full of flour and salt, Nayeli was outside chopping wood. The hatchet rose and fell in smooth rhythm, her face calm, her muscles sharp with effort. "Town's talking plenty," Caleb said, setting down the supplies. "They always talk," she replied without pausing. Thud. "Words are wind." "But wind can still cut if it blows too long," he frowned. "They say someone wants this land. Silver in the ground, maybe. You heard that before?" Her arms slowed, the hatchet resting against the block. She didn't look at him. Dakota heard it. Men came once, asked to buy. He told them no. Weeks later, he did not come home from hunting. The weight of her words sank heavy. Caleb had heard rumors of Dakota's death, but hearing it like this, framed with suspicion, with unspoken blame, made his gut twist. "You think he was killed for this land?" Caleb asked. Her eyes finally lifted to meet his. They were dark, steady, filled with a quiet fire. "I do not think." "I know." 2 nights later, the first threat came. Caleb had just banked the fire when the dogs outside started barking, low and mean. He grabbed his rifle, stepping out onto the porch. The moon lit the desert in ghostly silver, casting long shadows across the corral. And there, nailed to the fence post, was a note flapping in the wind. He pulled it free, the paper rough beneath his calloused fingers. 3 words, scrawled in charcoal: "Leave or burn." The dogs whined, pacing. Caleb scanned the darkness, but whoever had left, it was long gone. He carried the note inside, laying it on the table where Nayeli sat mending a shirt. She glanced at it once, then set down her needle. "They will not stop. Then we won't either," Caleb said. His voice came out harder than he expected. She studied him, searching his face as if weighing the truth of his words. Finally, she nodded once. "Then we prepare." From then on, life shifted. Caleb spent mornings patching the fence line, making sure no one could cut through the corral. He checked the roof for weak spots, reinforced the barn doors, and kept his rifle within reach at all times. Naeli, in turn, walked the land each evening, watching for tracks in the sand, reading signs Caleb could barely notice. One afternoon, while fixing the trough, Caleb found hoof prints circling the house. Fresh. Too fresh. Whoever it was hadn't bothered to hide their tracks, almost like they wanted him to know. That night, he told Naeli. Her expression was calm, but her eyes flashed with a warrior's memory. Fear is their weapon. If we bend, they win. Caleb admired her strength, though he'd never admit it aloud. It stirred something inside him, something that felt uncomfortably close to pride. But the threats didn't stay idle. A week later, someone set fire to the barn. Caleb woke to the smell of smoke, grabbed a bucket, and sprinted outside. Naeli was already there, hair loose, throwing sand onto the flames. Together they fought until the fire died, leaving the barn blackened but standing. On the charred wood, another message had been scrawled in soot. Last warning. Caleb stood there, chest heaving, hands blistered from the bucket handle. His heart hammered with fury. They think they can scare us off. But they don't know me. I don't scare easy. Naeli's gaze was steady, her face streaked with soot. She touched the pendant at her throat, then said softly, "Then we fight." Side by side. For the first time since their uneasy wedding, Caleb felt a strange, burning certainty. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about standing with her. Enemies lurked in the shadows, but so did something else, something fiercer, more dangerous and harder to deny, the spark between them. The desert had a way of holding its breath before a storm. The air grew heavy, the sky bruised purple, and the wind carried a taste of copper. Caleb had seen plenty of storms in his years on the range, but this one felt different, like the land itself was warning him. He was in the barn, tightening the latch on the feed door, when the first rumble rolled across the sky. Outside, the dogs barked and the horses stamped nervously. Then came Naeli's voice, sharp against the rising wind. "Caleb." Inside now. He stepped out, wiping his brow, and saw her striding toward him. Her braid whipped in the gusts, her skirts snapping like flags. Behind her, a wall of sand and lightning bore down on the homestead, swallowing the horizon whole. "Hellfire," Caleb muttered. "I didn't think it would hit this fast." She grabbed his arm, tugging him toward the house. The desert does not ask permission. They barely made it through the door before the storm slammed into the adobe walls. Wind howled, rattling the shutters. Sand hissed against the roof, seeping through cracks, filling the air with grit. Caleb shoved a chair against the door while Naeli dropped the bar across it. For a moment, they stood side by side, listening to the storm claw at their home. Inside, the fire flickered, casting shadows on the walls. The air felt close, charged with the same electricity that split the sky outside. Caleb sank onto the bench, running a hand over his face. "Well," he said, voice rough, "looks like we're stuck together a while." Naeli busied herself with the hearth, feeding the flames, but her movements were sharper than usual. He noticed the quick rise and fall of her chest, the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the kettle. "Storms pass," she said. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Maybe, but this one feels meaner than most." She didn't answer. Instead, she sat across from him, folding her hands in her lap. The silence stretched, filled only by the roar outside. Caleb studied her face, the strong lines, the calm mask she wore like armor. Yet behind it, he saw something else tonight. Weariness. Loneliness. The weight of fighting battles she hadn't chosen. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked quietly. Her eyes lifted to his, dark and steady. "Where would I go? My people are scattered. The town hates me. This land is all I have left." Caleb's chest tightened. He knew that feeling too well, the rootlessness, the way a man could drift and never belong. For the first time, he realized how much they had in common. The wind shrieked, rattling the door so hard Caleb half expected it to splinter. Instinctively, he reached across the table, covering her hands with his. Her skin was warm, steadying, but she stiffened under his touch. "I ain't trying to make you uneasy," he said quickly. He searched for the right words, something he wasn't used to doing. "Just want you to know you ain't alone here." "Not anymore." Her breath caught, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. Then slowly she relaxed. Her fingers turned, pressing lightly against his. The storm outside seemed to fade, or maybe it was just drowned out by the pounding in his chest. Caleb rose, moving around the table until he stood before her. She tilted her head up, their faces inches apart, the firelight dancing across her cheekbones. "You don't have to," she whispered, though her voice carried no conviction. "I know," he murmured, and then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle, not at first, more like the storm itself, fierce and unrelenting, breaking through walls neither of them had meant to build. But as their lips lingered, something shifted. The anger, the fear, the loneliness, they melted into a heat that left Caleb breathless. When they finally pulled apart, Nayeli's hand lingered against his chest, feeling the thunder of his heartbeat. Her eyes searched his as if testing whether this was real. "Why now?" she asked softly. Caleb swallowed hard. "Because life's too damn short to wait for the right time. And I reckon you needed to know I ain't here just 'cause the sheriff said so." The storm raged on outside, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Inside, the air crackled with something stronger than lightning, something that neither desert nor town could erase. For the first time since their uneasy marriage, Caleb felt it, the start of something bigger than both of them, something worth fighting for. The morning after the storm, the desert glistened as though it had been washed clean. Puddles shimmered in the hollows, and the air smelled of sage and wet earth. Caleb saddled his horse with a lighter step than usual, though he tried not to let it show. He still felt the memory of Nayeli's lips on his, the storm crackling through his veins long after the thunder had passed. She didn't mention the kiss, not at breakfast, not while tending the garden, not when she handed him a coil of rope to mend the corral fence. But she didn't shy from him either. Her silence wasn't cold anymore. It was something else. Something waiting. By midday, Caleb was showing her how to tie a calf rope loop, his hands guiding hers over the rough hemp. "Not too tight," he said. "You want it to run smooth through the horn." Her brow furrowed, tongue peeking at the corner of her mouth as she worked the rope. "Like this?" He chuckled. "Better than some greenhorns I've seen." The corners of her lips twitched, almost a smile. Almost. Later, she turned the lesson back on him. Out past the ridge, Nayeli led him to a narrow canyon where water pooled beneath the rocks. She showed him which cactus to cut for water, how to follow the faint prints of a jackrabbit, and how to listen for rattlers hiding in the brush. "You look at the desert and see emptiness," she told him. "But it is alive if you know how to look." Caleb tipped his hat back, studying her face in the sunlight. "Reckon I'm learning." And he was. Not just about the land. About her. That night, fire lit the sky again, but not from a storm. Caleb woke to the acrid sting of smoke. He bolted upright, hand groping for his rifle. Outside, the barn glowed red, flames clawing at the roof. Horses screamed in panic. Nayeli. She was already at the door, hair unbound, eyes fierce. Together they rushed into the night, buckets in hand, throwing water and sand against the blaze. Sparks stung Caleb's skin, smoke filled his lungs, but he fought on. Nayeli darted into the barn to cut loose the horses, her figure disappearing into the inferno. "Nayeli!" Caleb shouted, fear cutting him deeper than any blade. She stumbled out, coughing, driving two terrified horses ahead of her. Caleb grabbed her arm, steadying her as they poured the last of the water on the smoldering beams. Finally, the fire choked itself out, leaving only a charred skeleton of what once had been. On the blackened wall, Caleb saw the mark again, scrawled with ash this time. "Get out." He stood there, chest heaving, fists clenched. "That's it. I've had enough of cowards sneaking around like coyotes. They want this land, they'll have to face me." Nayeli touched his arm. Her hand trembled, but her eyes burned steady. "Not just you. Us." Her words wrapped around him, steadying his rage. For the first time, it wasn't just his fight. It was theirs. The next day, they rebuilt. Caleb hauled new boards from town, ignoring the glares and mutters of men who probably knew more than they let on. Nayeli gathered stone and clay, her hands raw by sundown. They worked side by side, sweat streaking their skin, neither complaining, neither slowing. That evening they collapsed on the porch steps, shoulders brushing. The desert stretched quiet, pink with twilight. "You could still walk away," Nayeli said softly, staring at the horizon. "The sheriff's bargain is kept. You married me. You don't owe me more than that." Caleb turned to her, voice low, steady. "I ain't here 'cause of a bargain. Not anymore. You hear me? I'm here 'cause this is worth fighting for. You. This land. Us." Her breath caught, eyes glistening in the fading light. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, just for a moment. It was small, fleeting, but to Caleb, it felt like more than any vow spoken in town. The fire had tried to burn them out. Instead, it had bound them tighter. And though the smoke still lingered, Caleb knew the real blaze was only just beginning. By the time the barn was rebuilt, Caleb knew the outlaws wouldn't stop. The threats had sharpened from whispers to fire, and the next step would be blood. He saw it in the way Nayeli scanned the horizon each morning, in the way her hand lingered near the bough she kept strung by the door. Then came the rider, a lanky boy barely old enough to shave. Galloped up one afternoon, dust streaking his face. He shoved a crumpled note into Caleb's hand and wheeled his horse without a word. Caleb unfolded it, high noon. Main Street. Bring the widow. Or burn. His jaw tightened. He crumpled the paper, tossed it into the fire. Nayeli's voice was quiet, steady. "They want us to be afraid." Caleb shook his head. "I'm done being hunted like a stray. Tomorrow we end this." The sun was a merciless eye over Cedar Ridge the next day, baking the dirt street until the air shimmered. Folks lined the boardwalks, whispering, waiting. The saloon doors flapped as men leaned out for a better view. It wasn't every day a town got itself a showdown. Caleb walked down the center of the street, hat low, rifle across his back. Beside him, Nayeli strode with bow in hand, quiver slung over her shoulder. Her braid swung like a banner in the wind. Together, they cut a figure no one in Cedar Ridge would soon forget. At the far end of the street, 5 men waited. Outlaws, but not strangers. Caleb recognized their faces, ranchers who'd eyed Nayeli's land with greedy smiles, drifters who spat the word Apache like it was poison. Their leader, a broad man named Harlan Pike, stepped forward, spurs jangling. His hand rested easy on the butt of his revolver. "Well, Turner," Pike drawled, voice carrying across the street. "Looks like you brought the squad just like we asked." "Saves us trouble dragging her out," murmurs rippled through the crowd. Caleb felt the heat rise in his chest, but he forced it down, his voice steady as a hammer. "You want this land, Pike, you'll have to bury me first." Pike smirked, baring yellow teeth. "That can be arranged." The street went silent. A hawk cried overhead. Then, in a blur, steel flashed. Pike drew fast, faster than Caleb remembered him being. But Caleb was ready. His rifle came up in one smooth motion, shot cracking like thunder. Pike's hat spun off his head as the bullet clipped his shoulder, sending him reeling. The others fired back. The street exploded with gunfire, wood splintering, glass shattering. Nayeli moved like lightning. An arrow flew from her bow, striking one outlaw square in the thigh. He screamed, dropping his pistol. Another arrow sang through the air, grazing a man's ear and sending him stumbling. Caleb ducked behind a water trough, firing shot after shot. Dust stung his eyes, smoke filled the air. Nayeli crouched beside him, knocking another arrow. Their shoulders brushed, hearts pounding in the same rhythm. "You always fight this mean?" He shouted over the gunfire. Her lips twitched, almost a smile. "Only when my land is at stake." Pike bellowed from across the street, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Kill 'em both." Two outlaws charged, revolvers blazing. Caleb swung his rifle butt hard, knocking one to the ground. Nayeli loosed an arrow into the other's hand, sending his gun spinning. Caleb finished it with a crack across the jaw. The last man standing froze, eyes darting from Caleb's rifle to Nayeli's drawn bow. Then he turned tail, sprinting down the street. The crowd jeering after him. Pike staggered back, rage and pain twisting his face. He raised his revolver with his good arm, aiming at Nayeli. Caleb's heart lurched too far, too fast. Thwip. Nayeli's arrow struck, pinning Pike's gun hand to the wooden post beside him. He howled, dropping the weapon, eyes wide with disbelief. The street erupted in silence. All that could be heard was the ragged breathing of the defeated outlaws and the creak of the tifa saloon sign in the wind. Caleb lowered his rifle. Nayeli straightened, bow still steady, eyes blazing like the desert sun. Together they walked forward, stopping before Pike. "You thought you could burn us out," Caleb said, voice low, fierce. "But we're still standing." Nayeli pulled the arrow free, letting Pike crumple to his knees. Her voice was soft but cut sharper than steel. "This land is ours. No one takes it." For a long moment, no one in Cedar Ridge moved. Then, slowly, the townsfolk began to murmur, not in hate this time, but in awe. They had seen something they couldn't ignore, a ranch hand and an Apache widow standing as one. Unbreakable. When the smoke cleared, Cedar Ridge wasn't the same town anymore. Folks drifted back from the boardwalks in stunned silence, their faces caught between disbelief and something else, respect. The outlaws lay broken in the dust, and Harlan Pike was hauled off by the sheriff, his arm bound, his pride shattered. Caleb stood in the center of Main Street, hat tipped low, rifle slung across his back. His shirt was torn, dust streaking his face, but he was still standing. Beside him, Nayeli held her bow at her side, her braid loose, her chin high. Together, they looked less like a punished pair of outcasts and more like victors carved from the very stone of the desert. Sheriff Boone pushed through the crowd, eyes scanning the scene. He gave Caleb a long look, then shifted to Nayeli. "Town owes you both more than it'll admit," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been pride. "You showed him today. Ain't a soul here can deny it." The preacher, pale and nervous, stepped forward. Perhaps the Lord's will was in this union after all." The crowd muttered, some nodding, others scowling. But the seed had been planted. Where there had been only hate and suspicion, now there was something new. Doubt. Doubt that maybe the widow wasn't the enemy. Doubt that maybe Caleb Turner wasn't a wasted drifter. Caleb turned to Nayeli, meeting her eyes. He remembered their wedding day, her vow spoken without warmth, her refusal to kiss him before the town. And now, standing in the dust and the aftermath of a gunfight, he realized something had shifted, not just in the people around them, but between them. "You think they'll ever leave us in peace?" he asked. Nayeli's gaze swept the crowd, then the wide desert beyond. "Peace is not given," she said softly. "It is taken." And kept. Her words struck deep. Caleb reached for her hand, not cautious, not uncertain, but firm. She didn't pull away. The townsfolk fell into silence, eyes drawn to them like moths to flame, and then Caleb did what he hadn't dared that first day. He kissed her. This time, it wasn't forced by storm or circumstance. It was deliberate, defiant, a claim made not just to her but to every soul watching. Nayeli kissed him back, steady and strong, her hand rising to his chest. The street held its breath, the whole town watching as the ranch hand and the Apache widow sealed their bond in plain sight. When they pulled apart, the world felt changed. An old rancher spat into the dirt, muttering, "Never thought I'd see the day." A young boy, eyes wide, whispered, "They look like heroes." And somewhere in the hush, a woman murmured, "Maybe it's time this town learned." The days that followed weren't easy. Some folks still turned their backs, still muttered curses when Caleb rode into town. But others nodded in quiet respect. The blacksmith offered him nails without charging extra. The schoolteacher stopped by the homestead with books for Nayeli. A shift had begun, not a landslide, but a crack in the old stone walls of hate. On the homestead, Caleb and Nayeli worked side by side. The barn stood tall again, stronger than before. The garden thrived under her care, the cattle under his. At night, they sat on the porch, shoulders brushing, watching the desert stars. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of unspoken trust, of something growing steady as roots. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the mesas, Caleb leaned back, hat tipped against the post. "You ever think," he asked, "that storm was what brought us here? Not the sheriff, not the council. Just that storm." Nayeli turned to him, eyes glinting in the fire of dusk. "Storms destroy, but they also bring new life. Without rain, nothing grows." Caleb smiled, slow and certain. Then maybe that kiss was the rain, her laughter low, rich, rare, spilled into the desert air. It was the sound of something healing, something beginning. And so the legend took root. Folks in Cedar Ridge would tell it in whispers, how a forced marriage meant to bury two outcasts instead sparked a love that shook the town to its bones. How one kiss, in the middle of the Wild West, changed everything. Forever.